Hello, guys. Thank you so much for holding. My apologies for the delay. We're just gathering all of our attendees and our panelists, so thank you for joining us. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Brooke. I am the Director of Recruitment here at WorldTeach, but more importantly, I was a volunteer last year in Colombia, so I will tell you guys all about that momentarily. Just kind of a reminder, you guys are muted right now, so if you, and I can unmute you, but if you want to write anything in, please go ahead. There's a chat panel on the right, and whether it's a question or a concern about like the volume, because we had an issue just a moment ago with an echo, so just feel free to kind of raise your hand or write in, and then we'll address your issues. But right now you are all muted, so no worries if there are any dogs barking or babies howling over there. All right, we're just going to go forward. So here we go.
I don't know.
All right, I do hear a bit of noise, just FYI. Okay, so again, to introduce myself, my name is Brooke. We are here tonight talking about living and teaching in Namibia. So our WorldTeach program departs for Namibia this coming December, which we're super excited about. So this here in front of us is our agenda. So kind of before we jump into that, just to let you know, we've got some listeners joining us from literally all over the world, which is super exciting. Some of them have started, new applications. Other people have just been accepted into the program. And then people are just, listening in to learn more about our year-long teaching program in Namibia, or kind of WorldTeach in general. So thanks you guys so much. We have a couple alumni on the line to help us get a real look at what it's actually like to live and teach over there. So thanks you guys for joining us. All right, so we are going to, introduce the panelists and learn a bit about their backgrounds, how they ended up joining WorldTeach. I think that's always an interesting story. Then we're going to provide an overview of the WorldTeach organization before jumping into the specifics of our Namibia program, including our partnership with their Ministry of Education and why there's actually a need for us to be there in the first place. So after that, we'll be discussing living in Namibia. So what are the housing placements going to be like? Who will you be living like? Who will you be living with? What's the monthly stipend? How do people get involved in the community outside of school? We'll definitely be talking about health in Namibia, because I know that that's a question that everybody has. And we'll be able to get to hear the personal experiences and stories from our alumni who are on the line. So after that, we will be talking a bit about the Namibian educational system, and then we're going to talk about actually being in the classroom. So what are the major cultural challenges that our volunteers face there? What sort of resources will you have, or perhaps won't you have, in the classroom? And how these placements get made to begin with. So we'll be addressing that, and then just quickly reviewing the application process before opening it up for questions from our listeners, for our alumni or myself on the line. But let's be honest, they're much more exciting because they've been to Namibia, where I haven't. So as I mentioned throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the chat function that you see on your right, hopefully. And if I can't answer the question right then and there, I'll save it for the end, so we will address it. All right, just one second. I'm just dealing with Emily here, one of our panelists. She's trying to get in. All right, so here I am. That is me with my sixth graders last year in Colombia. So as I mentioned, I'm the Director of Recruitment and Communications here at WorldTeach. I was teaching last year in Colombia, and it was probably the most amazing thing I ever did. Of course, difficult, very difficult, but extremely rewarding. It's true what I say there. I do love teaching now, but I hate 8th and 9th graders, which is why I put a picture of my 6th graders up there, because that's before they turn into terrors. I'd had an interesting background before joining WorldTeach. You'll learn that most volunteers haven't actually taught before joining WorldTeach, nor have they studied education. I personally had studied journalism and sociology, and then did some work in corporate America before joining WorldTeach, and it definitely changed my life's direction, priorities, definition of happiness, health, my profession, everything. So moving on to our very dynamic panelists. I'm going to go with Jen first because Jen's on the line with us. Emily is still figuring out her connection. So Jen, I would love for you to introduce yourself. Jen, can you hear us?
Hi, yeah, I just had to unmute myself.
Awesome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Great. I'm Jen Pearson. I also had teaching experience before starting my WorldTeach experience. I had taught for 4 years prior to going to Namibia for the District of Columbia Public Schools, and I got a leave of absence, so I've returned to the same position, the same school, and I've always taught pre-K. So teaching in Namibia was a new challenge because I taught 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade there, which is roughly equivalent to ages here. So it was a lot older kids, and dealing with adolescents was a new challenge, but a fun one because I was able to have some more advanced conversations with them.
Awesome. So can I ask you, you might not remember this, but how did you first find or come across or learn of WorldTeach?
I think my second year teaching, I started thinking about going abroad and teaching abroad for a time, a year, a certain amount of time. Because in undergrad, I studied international studies, and I've always liked to travel. And I did a semester abroad in Senegal, and I'd always made it a goal that I would spend a year abroad doing something, but living abroad for a whole year before I turned 30. And I found WorldTeach in my second year of teaching when I was just searching for ways to teach abroad and kind of put it on the back burner. It was in the back of my mind, and then 2 years later, when I was 29, I figured out that I was going to achieve that goal. I needed to do it now, so then I applied. And I chose Namibia because I had experience with Namibia, and in college I was part of a service learning program that for 4 years we had connections in Namibia, and we raised money towards the fight against and the awareness of HIV/AIDS in Namibia, and I had actually traveled there for a month. So I wanted to choose a country that I knew about, and I was also attracted to it because of its long history for WorldTeach, since it had been the longest serving program, or longest program that volunteers had been in at the time.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Okay, now let's see. I think we've got Emily, so let's see if we can get her. Emily, can you hear us? Okay, I'm not sure if she's going to come through. I can kind of quickly speak on her behalf. She was also an alum of our Namibia program back in 2012. You can see her kind of quick bio here. Let's see, I do hope that she gets in here because I can't do her justice, but it's interesting to see, you know, how, for example, Jen, you're back working in education, and Emily is kind of making her way back there. Right now she's in sales and marketing. So it's a good intro to how our volunteers come from different educational backgrounds, and then definitely go off into different careers once they return from their program. So she was teaching at a different school, teaching English to 6th through 8th graders, and also computer technology to the older kids. So you'll see that we actually do a lot of computer technology down in Namibia. It's been kind of a recent change for us, and it's been hugely requested because it's, you know, obviously not something that everybody else can teach. Not everybody has access to that sort of thing or didn't grow up with computers, so that's a huge demand for us. So let's see here. It looks like I have Kristen, another alum on the line, who's offering to speak on her behalf. So Kristen, let me see if I can get you unmuted. All right, Kristen, I can hear you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. So if you want to, I believe you and you and Emily, you guys served together, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
And I can speak on her behalf. We were friends before we even went there, so we kind of went through the whole application process together, and we ended up being placed kind of close to each other, so we had very similar experiences.
perfect.
So
Well,
until she joins, I can kind of introduce her.
definitely.
But we both went to UNC Chapel Hill. I studied international studies. She studied journalism, just like you, Brooke. But we both knew that we wanted to do something. I knew that I wanted to do something out of the country, and my focus was on Africa, so I knew that I wanted to end up there. And she was kind of more flexible, so we decided to apply to this WorldTeach Namibia program together. We both loved that it was 1 year. It seemed like the perfect amount of time because it was long enough to, really get a hold of what you were doing, but not, the same time commitment as something like Peace Corps, which was over 2 years. So it was much more of an appealing time frame. She lived with an Afrikaner man near her school,
Hmm.
so she had a much more, I guess you would say, Western sort of living situation than a lot of the volunteers. And she taught English. She taught multiple English classes to different grades and computer technology. And something that Emily did, which is really neat, is while she was there, she utilized her resources to sponsor and build a computer lab. Her school had an extra classroom, and while she was there, she kind of fundraised through the connections she had in the States to have some laptops sent over. And so she actually built and established an entire computer classroom, and so kind of transformed their computer process at that school. Whereas in my case, I was at a Millennium Challenge Corporation school, so there were a bunch of schools that were actually completely renovated in 2011 by the MCC in Namibia, and my school was one of those. So I had a completely furnished computer lab, 35 laptops, state-of-the-art, well, state-of-the-art for Namibia, projection screen and everything. So our setups were very different, and I was teaching ICT, or basic computer, to grades 8 to 10, or 5 to 10, sorry. So that's kind of both of us. Sorry if I just talked for too long.
No, that's perfect. Kristen, thank you so much. You are saving us. And I love that you guys, obviously had that connection prior. So very cool. Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to go on. We've got a lot more questions and topics to cover. This is one of my favorite pictures that I found from some of the other volunteers from Namibia. Quickly, kind of just to introduce the mission of WorldTeach. So we, in the history of us as well, we started back in '86 as a student-led organization through Harvard. So definitely have that academic background and foundation, but we are now our own independent nonprofit organization. We've got almost, no, actually over 7,000 alumni from over 16 different countries where we're currently serving. So we have year-long, semester, and our summer programs. So I'd say our mission statement sums it up pretty well that, we've got two functions, two purposes going on here. It's, our work is obviously changing the community where we serve, but also absolutely the volunteer. And I think all of the alumni on the line right now can vouch for that you leave a different person. So there's our mission statement. We're partnering with governments, usually the Ministry of Education and other NGOs in low and middle income countries. Sometimes it's developing countries, sometimes it's more developed, but working specifically in, for example, the rural regions or the more underserved regions that need our help. So we're providing them with volunteer teachers to help them meet those local needs and definitely promote responsible global citizenship for our volunteers. So let's continue. And I just got a message from Emily. She says Kristen's doing a great job, so thank you for speaking on her behalf. That's how our volunteers work together for sure. So support for the volunteer and the volunteer fee. I like to put this up front right away because it is not a hidden secret that this program is very expensive. So the way that we work is that in every country where we are, these ministries, they're the ones inviting us there. And if they're inviting us there, they got to pay for us. So they give us as much funding as possible. Sometimes it's everything, and sometimes it's kind of just enough. And unfortunately in Namibia, we don't receive the entire funding from the ministry. On average, it costs like over $10,000 for a volunteer for the year program. So they're giving us essentially $6,000, and the volunteer is paying the rest. So I do like to put that right up front. We do a lot of volunteering amongst our volunteers. We do a lot of fundraising, my apologies, a lot of fundraising amongst our volunteers, and WorldTeach is here to help you guys with that. It's an amazing opportunity for the fact that your local community can get super involved in a very easy, very simple way, and you can actually get abroad with that money. And even like Emily did, I mean, raise additional money and create a computer lab that's just ridiculous and amazing. And Emily, I know you're listening. Thank you. That's awesome. So kind of quickly, just to show, you're probably already reading this long list here. So this is what that volunteer fee and all the funding that comes from the ministry is actually going towards. So they're paying for your visa, your housing, which we'll get into all those details later, your monthly stipend, which is essentially the equivalent of $350 US. You have your full-time in-country field staff, your health and emergency evacuation insurance, which is very important, as we know, and training. We're going to get into training more shortly, but training is very important. So we recognize we're not sending trained teachers. So we've got our month-long orientation when you first get there, and then also additional trainings as you go on through the year. Mid-service conference, end-of-service conference. It's all of your meals and housing during all of those training conferences. And your teacher quality program. We cannot forget we started with Harvard, so they make us do like teaching things. No, so this is actually great because it does allow you to actually grow as a teacher because, you know, unlike Jen, most of our volunteers haven't taught before and they need help. So lesson plans, creating assessments, you know, how to actually manage your classroom. These are all things that we go over during orientation, and then they're reinforced every month with your quality coordinators who are back in my office here in Boston. All right, we're going to quickly move on to some more exciting things. Education in general in Namibia, and then how WorldTeach kind of plays into that. And don't forget, guys, if you have questions, please send them in to us, and then we'll address them as we go. All right, so you'll kind of see kind of a brief introduction here. So it kind of boils down to the fact that Namibia has been facing a teacher shortage for a while, historically, if you will. But the real reason why we were first invited into Namibia back in 1990 is because that's like right after they claimed their independence. They started initiating English as the language of instruction, and they didn't have enough teachers who were actually qualified to teach in English. So that was the main reason why we were first brought in. So we still teach English there, but now we've been requested to teach math and science as well. And as I quickly mentioned earlier, computer technology. That's obviously the way of the future. And so as you heard, I have never been to Namibia, but when I see these videos and pictures of the kids in the classroom with the computers, it's amazing. Any child around the world with a computer is awesome, but these kids are they just look so happy. And I'm pretty sure our volunteers enjoy teaching that as well, because you won't have those opportunities here, or really in many parts of the world. You can teach English anywhere, but I have a couple math majors at a university that I was meeting with the other day, and they were so excited to hear about this opportunity because they've never taught computer science. They've studied it forever, but they haven't had an opportunity to actually teach it. So we've got some really great things going on there. Let's see. So again, to kind of push this again, you know, we've been invited by the ministry. We're only helping them with the certain things that they've requested in the certain regions that they need. So making sure that, you know, we're not taking positions away from other teachers, or we're not, just being that North American who's on campus. We're actually filling an existing void. Okay, so moving on. Living in Namibia. So before we get into the classroom, I think a lot of people are concerned about actually picturing their lives there, because this is not just a trip. This is not vacation. This is your life. And when you come home and your family or your friends say, "How was your trip?" you can be like, "No, you are wrong. This was my life. It was everything. I lived and breathed this, and I'm no longer the same person." So I want to kind of quickly get into actually living there. So the majority of our volunteers are placed at government schools in rural areas where there's obviously the shortage of qualified teachers. Sometimes we are working at private schools as well as church-affiliated schools. And I'm going to get into that placement process as to how you get to a certain school. But first I want to hear from the alumni. So Jen, let's start with you. Tell us about, your housing, where you lived, who you lived with, and the amenities that you had, like, in your actual housing.
I lived in teacher housing that was really close to the school. Kind of behind the school were a bunch of small units, and it was all mainly teachers except for one house that the policemen lived in. And our house was split into basically 2 units, almost like 2 apartments. So I had kind of like one big room that served as kitchen, living space, everything, and then a separate room that was the bedroom. And I had like a table so I could eat at, some old desks from the school that served as other tables for my uses, a fridge, an oven with a hot plate type stovetop, and a bed and a dresser. And then on the other side of the house where the 3rd grade teacher lived with her family was where the bathroom was. So the bathroom was on the other side, and I shared that. There was running water.
Great. That's very good that there was running water. And what about internet?
About halfway through my service, the school got wireless, so I had internet that I could even pick up at my house. I used a Netman for about the first half of the time, and there was electricity.
You used a what? I'm sorry?
A Netman, which is you could plug it in and you paid for it, kind of like you paid for cell service to get internet. So you paid for how much internet you wanted.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. And Kristen, how about yourself?
Okay, yeah, so I lived in a, what they call a homestead, basically in a house with a family, and my connection was that one of the girls who lived there was also a teacher at my school. So my school was supposed to have teacher housing, but it was never built. So when they, had me placed there, they desperately tried to find somewhere to place me, and this family volunteered, which ended up working out wonderfully. They lived about 10 minutes away from the school. I lived with, I'm not really sure how many people I lived with. It was always unclear as to who actually lived there. And the girl I taught with had wonderful English, so we became pretty good friends. And then there was some communication barrier issues, but I like to think that I worked through them a little bit. But it was difficult living with a large family who did not speak much English, but we learned to communicate in other ways. But I had my own room. I had running water. One of the nice things about living with a family was that they cooked for me a lot at the beginning, and so it was kind of a nice way to get into the actual life there, eating the traditional foods. My school eventually got internet. It wasn't the most reliable, but it's as reliable as you're really going to get in Namibia. My house never had internet because we were out in the village. But yeah, so I lived with a lot of people. Most people who, at least from what I remember, most people who worked in MCC schools did have teacher housing. I was kind of in a rare situation. Most people in my kind of school lived in teacher housing that was right on the campus of the school, and so their setup was a little different. They lived with a bunch of different teachers, kind of more like Jen, and some of them did have internet right there. So they're kind of a wide variety of living arrangements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it definitely requires a bit of flexibility when it comes to that, because I know that those living situations can sometimes change at the last minute. Things fall through. Like you're saying, a school was supposed to provide housing and didn't. So those are definitely the challenges that we face in some of these countries. How about, let's see, Jen, so weekend extracurricular activities, what were you doing when you weren't on school grounds, when you were on your own?
So I was pretty rural. It was about 75 Ks, like a couple hours drive into the closest town. So I stayed in the village most weekends. About 1 weekend a month I would go into town, probably with another teacher, either Friday after school or Saturday, and do a huge grocery shopping trip. But other than that, I was mostly in my village, and I got really into just being creative and cooking and trying out new things, like actually making bread from scratch and noodles, and spent a lot of time just trying out different recipes. And then I would often have children visit me on the weekends, so as I was doing things in my house, like washing laundry, the kids would come over. Sometimes we would play cards. Sometimes they would just play cards with each other on my floor if I was busy. And so they were probably my closest friends. And every few months or so, I would go to Swakopmund with a volunteer that was nearby. She was a Peace Corps volunteer. She was the only other volunteer close to me in my region. And then there was a volunteer in Swakopmund that we would stay with. So then we'd spend a weekend in the city and have all the amenities of being in a city again, which it's not really a city by American standards, but Swakopmund was big for Namibia.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I can picture those kids on your floor, and that's just awesome, especially when there's homemade bread.
Yeah, and they would sometimes come and make Namibian bread for me, which was delicious and full of butter. My favorite was when they brought all their cardboard scraps and actually made cell phones out of cardboard on my floor. So I had a cardboard factory. I think that was my favorite Saturday afternoon.
That's awesome. Thank you. Okay, Kristen, yourself, what were you guys doing in your free
Well, I
time?
guess I was up in Oshana region, and I had a very different setup than Jen in that while my village was kind of rural, I was much closer to a quote-unquote city, and I was also closer to a lot of volunteers. So we, a lot of weekends, we got together just for a little bit in town to meet up and, talk about teacher stuff. We also met some friends, some Afrikaner friends, and through them we did a few different trips around northern Namibia, which was really cool to kind of see different areas because the geography of Namibia is so varied. So we got to see all different areas of the north through that. So you definitely, depending on where you are, there's definitely some weekend trips you can get, you can do. And then, when I was in the village, I lived with a family, and the person I hung out with most was a 2-year-old. So we did a lot of coloring, and actually I'm not very good at having downtime, so it did really save me. I had a hard drive of movies and TV shows that I had kind of gathered from everyone. I think everyone kind of did the same thing. So sometimes when I was home, I would either, watch some stuff, or I would put on a movie for my family, which they thought was really cool. And I also, to kind of, get out of my house in my village, I did a lot of running, which, because no one in northern Namibia runs for exercise, so they thought that was just so entertaining. So I collected quite a running crew. So pretty much any time I would run, which I did a lot on the weekends when I was there, and pretty much every day during the week, there would be a gathering of, 10 to 20 kids and adults behind me. So that became a fun little activity. Kind of strange, but fun.
That actually makes me really happy because oftentimes, North Americans go to these foreign countries and they want to go running outside, but because it is so just rare for these people, it can become kind of unsafe. But it doesn't sound like that was an issue for you.
Well, the first time I was running, I was a little scared because I had my headphones in, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that a lot of people were chasing me, and one of them had a rifle, but they thought I was being chased by something, so they were trying to protect me. So, no, I never felt unsafe, and even when I did, it's because they were trying to scare away anything that was hurting me.
Wow. Okay, good. Very good. So in general, I guess, would you both say that you felt like you definitely had opportunities that either you created or that your school or host family created for you, to really immerse yourself in the community? And it's not easy. You definitely have to work for it sometimes. But would you guys agree that definitely was there for you? Jen?
Yeah, it's challenging. I think it's really, a lot of it's up to the volunteer to take initiative to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And, as much as you can learn the language as possible, like that really helps because, at a certain, people are really open and welcoming, but like there's a definite limit and creates a barrier when you don't know very much of the local language. I know that was definitely the case with me. I got to know the secretary and the other teachers, and I would, talk to them and sometimes be invited to their houses for dinner, but I feel the reason why I never really got very close to anyone at my school or in my village was because I didn't have a good grasp of the local language.
And so that brings up a good point, actually, before I let you answer, Kristen. So obviously, one of the official languages, if not the only official language, is English, but the majority of people don't have the best grasp on it. Could you respond to that?
Kristen, you want me to respond?
Or Jen, because if you were feeling that that there is that gap, that communication barrier.
Yeah,
there definitely is. Jen, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. It could vary also by where you are in Namibia. I know with the Herero people, there was definitely a big gap. And also my colleagues at my school, probably because it was more rural than some of the other site placements, it tended to have a lot older teachers. A lot of my colleagues were a lot older, and so they were, in their schooling, was done in Afrikaans. So when they didn't share a native language, because there was a Damara speaker at my school, they would default to Afrikaans, not English. And so, like, especially with my colleagues, like that was their third language. And so they would speak English to me and be open to that and welcoming. And I did, go to dinner and go to birthday parties and special occasions. But there was definitely a language barrier for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good to know. Kristen, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, so, I definitely noticed, and I think that probably it goes for pretty much anywhere, but the closer you would get to an urban area, the better the English would be. It was much more clear, and they had a much bigger grasp on it, but it seemed like the more rural you were, that wasn't the case. But a lot of that has to do, English only became the official language in 1994. So there's this gap where, the learners are learning English in school, but they're not ever really forced to use it in their home, so they're not, learning it as well. Or, there's not a constant presence of English. But I will say my English, or my colleagues at work, whenever they were talking to me, they did a very good job of trying to use as much English as possible. And in the schools, they're supposed to teach only in English and everything. There were some staff meetings that would start in 5 minutes of English and then 2 hours of Oshiwambo, and I had no idea what was going on. But I feel like generally especially when it was focused on communication towards me, they did a very good job of at least trying to communicate in English. But language barrier was definitely an issue. Like I said, I lived with a family of, I don't even know how many, and there were only one or two that could completely effectively communicate in English, and others knew words here and there, just like I knew words here and there in Oshawango. So it was just kind of a, combining of languages to get your point across.
Mm-hmm. So Namibia is an interesting country because obviously I feel like there are perhaps different dialects in different parts of the country, and so that obviously causes an issue for the volunteers. But I did want to bring up, since we're talking about language, there is no requirement that our volunteers know the local language. Obviously, in some countries, for example, where they speak Spanish, it might be more common that someone does know the language, but in a place like Namibia, it's probably not going to happen. During orientation, if you guys remember, did you have language immersion classes? Because it's weird when, when the official language is English, but obviously there's a complete different, situation going on behind the official language. So did you guys get a bit of the language immersion during orientation?
Yes, we, so
Yeah,
we
it
were
was
divided.
limited.
Right, yeah, Jen, you got it.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so we were divided into our regions based on the languages that were spoken. So even though English is the official language, there were, at least where we were placed, there were, I think, 4 or 5 groups of languages being spoken amongst the volunteers, and there's even, there's a lot more than that in Namibia. And we had 4 days during which we had classes in whichever language. And if I could go back, I would, and I do feel like I tried to pay attention, but there was a lot going on. And I did pay attention, but I would focus a lot more and spend a lot of extra time during orientation trying to practice that language. Because, try to find a way to make it a little bit longer or spend more time one-on-one with that instructor. Because it's hard, and especially in somewhere where English is the official language, there's not a ton of focus on language immersion, and though it's there, I feel like it's up to the volunteer to make the most of it during orientation.
Yeah, let me comment on that as well. During orientation, it's obviously structured, and the field director is the one creating the itinerary, the schedule, and all that. But after orientation ends, that's when the real immersion and learning starts for the volunteers. So, for example, me in Colombia, I was determined to become fluent in Spanish, and so I ended up giving English lessons, like tutoring, for free English lessons to administrators at my school, to neighbors in my town, to like anybody that would ask, really, because I then wanted them to teach me Spanish. So even just the opportunity of speaking with them, even if it wasn't a formal class, because let's be honest, none of us were technically teachers, that's really the opportunity for immersion. So, during orientation, when you're with all the other volunteers, you're going to be speaking English when you wake up in the morning and before you go to bed at night. But once you get to town, once you get to your placement, that's when that changes. And then all of a sudden you find yourself 6 months later, perhaps dreaming in another language, which is a beautiful thing, but it takes a lot of work, and you definitely have to dedicate yourself to that, especially, it sounds like, in Namibia. So, okay, thank you guys for that very important side note. I'm going to quickly jump to this question on the monthly stipend, because money is very important, and then we'll go on to actually teaching in the classroom. So, Jen, could you tell me how that stipend worked out for you? How did you budget for it? Was it a struggle at times? Where did you spend the majority of your money?
The farther you are from town, the easier it is to live on the stipend. I didn't struggle at all with, I didn't spend very much of my own money at all. Only on holidays, only when I was traveling did I ever have to spend my own money. And even then, like I still had some stipend to spend on holidays and traveling. I spent most of it on electricity and groceries probably, but since I wasn't going to town, I wasn't going out and wasn't eating out and making my own food, it really wasn't too difficult for me to live off that stipend for the year.
Great. Kristen, do you have any input on that?
Oh, I mean, the stipend was absolutely enough. I never felt like I never felt tight on money because, I mean, you're not paying for rent and the food costs in Namibia are pretty low, so especially because you're probably going to be cooking for yourself almost every night of the week, if not every night of the week. You really, I mean, I was able to save a good amount of that money and use it for traveling and holidays. I didn't ever feel like it wasn't enough.
Great. Also, Jen, you mentioned a good note about electricity. So just for everybody listening, usually those things like utilities, it depends based on your housing. Sometimes they'll be included in the money that WorldTeach and the ministry gives directly to your host family or your landlord, if you will. And sometimes that contract will be different, meaning that you will be paying for the use of electricity because it could vary so much, or it could be like, so expensive or just so inaccessible in certain areas, so that does vary by placement. And then a note on placements, because how do you know if you're going to end up in an area like Jen's or like Kristen's or completely different? Because as we're getting the sense, all of the placements throughout Namibia are very different. So after you're accepted into the program, you fill out what's called a volunteer profile form, and that's when you say, I have worked with kids in the past and I really want to continue with elementary education, or I do not like children, please do not let me work with like third graders. I know I'm going to Namibia, so most of the placements will be fairly rural, if you will. I use that term lightly, but I do not want to be super far away. I do not want to be in the smallest village. I do not want to be really far away from other volunteers, or perhaps you do. So that's when you take the opportunity to spell out your preferences, and then based on your experience and your preferences together, the field director will place you where he thinks you're going to be the most successful. I would say most of the time, and I do believe this from my own experience and my co-volunteers experience in Colombia, that you end up where you're supposed to be. It might not be where you want to be. It might not be where you think you're supposed to be at the beginning, but I think it slowly shows you the reason why you're there, whether it's because of like certain students at your school or certain needs at your school or the host family that you get paired with or the town that all of a sudden becomes like very inspirational for you. And you're not going to see that at the beginning, and you're definitely going to struggle through days and nights when you're thinking, maybe this isn't for me, or maybe this is like more difficult than I thought it would be. But then you go to school and you do your job and people thank you, and all of a sudden you see yourself as a teacher and you see yourself living in this place, not just visiting, not just traveling, but actually part of the community, and you recognize that you're there for a reason. So that placement process is very important, and we take it very, very seriously, and it's always addressed, with the volunteer and the field director. And sometimes there are extenuating circumstances when things happen, and people will sometimes be transferred to a different school or a different host family, etc. But in general, that placement process is taken very seriously. Okay, going to go on to the next because we're getting through a lot of good stuff, but I don't want to keep anyone too late. I want to quickly touch about health. Obviously, everybody is, concerned with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. At this point, WorldTeach is definitely not concerned about it touching Namibia. However, that being said, our field director is looking at this daily, and he's working with his contacts down in Namibia through the Peace Corps, the U.S. Embassy, and of course the State Department, making sure that that is still the case. So if that were to change, then things would change for us. We have closed programs in the past due to these concerns. For example, SARS in China. We are back in China after that ended. So yes, unfortunately, sometimes programs do close for that purpose, but right now we do not see that at all as a concern, thank God, and knock on wood. And my program manager, she said, well, you know, it might be safer in Namibia than it is in the United States these days. So let's all just hope for, I don't know, containment somehow. But in general, physical health preparations for Namibia, I put a bit of information there. There are no specific immunizations required for volunteers coming from North America, but as you know, we do accept volunteers from all over the world that are native English speakers, and so if you are coming from another country, it's definitely important to research what requirements are going to be expected of you from that country. Especially also if you're thinking that you will be traveling outside of Namibia, but within Africa, those other countries might be, especially these days, they're going to be looking for certain vaccinations. So there's a lot of research to be done on this end, but no, you know, and like things like malaria medicine, which I wrote a note there about that a lot of our volunteers can get that prescription filled there. Ladies, do you guys have anything to note on this? I don't know if you have any more specifics as to like certain medications that you took or things that you were worried about that ended up not being important or vice versa. Starting with Jen. No? Kristen? Hello?
Hey, I brought about a 4-month supply of malaria medication, just because I wasn't sure how easy I'd be able to get it, but it's very easy to get there and it's much cheaper. So I would definitely recommend bringing a few months so you can get settled, but don't bring a full year because you can get it for cheaper in Namibia.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of any other. I mean, you can get pretty much anything there. Like, don't fill up your suitcase with ibuprofen because you can get something similar there.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. Almost anything you can get in Namibia.
Awesome.
I didn't get any additional immunizations only because I had been immunized a lot studying abroad in African countries and travel before Namibia. I've traveled internationally a bit, so I had kind of all the basic immunizations you would recommend, but I didn't get them specially for Namibia. I wasn't in a place where malaria was, so I didn't bring any malaria pills, and I only took some, I think, when I went to Zambia for a holiday. I don't think I brought any special medications.
Okay, awesome. Sorry.
One quick note.
Yeah, go ahead.
When I was getting ready to go to Namibia, they recommended or suggested that I get a rabies shot, which I regret every day because it was $1,000 and I never once needed anything like that. So don't spend $1,000 on a rabies shot.
Very good to know. And actually, Emily, who's writing in, is saying the same thing, that, yeah, don't do that. I mean, unfortunately, you could get rabies in America, but does that mean that we all go and get that shot? Absolutely not. So, yes, you have to.
Yeah, the yellow fever, I was never asked for evidence of it, but there are a lot of neighboring countries that require that. So it is good if you're planning to travel around the area.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. This is super helpful. Thank you, guys. Okay, we're going to go on to, I'd say, the most important part, teaching in Namibia. So this is why we're all going there, because like I said, this is not vacation. This is not a trip. This is hard work. Teaching in any part of the world is hard work. Teaching in certain countries where we work is even harder. So going forward on that, if only I can find my notes on it. Sorry, guys. Okay, so as you see here, our volunteers, as I mentioned, we're teaching English, math, science, computer technology. I want to hear from the ladies as to what you guys actually taught, because I know, according to our field director, who I should have mentioned, Brett, he would have been on the line right now if it wasn't, I believe, almost 2 o'clock in the morning in Namibia. And so Brett was saying, you know, the volunteers are going to teach one primary subject, whether that's English, math, science, and then there you can always get involved in secondary subjects. So perhaps computer technology or art or even like gym classes, whatever that is. So let's start. My first question actually, well, I'll quickly introduce orientation. As I mentioned, you know, we're not sending trained teachers. We need to prepare our volunteers as much as possible to teach in a classroom and to teach in a Namibian classroom. So for that, we have our like 3 to 4 week long orientation when you first get to the country. So that's when you're going to do lesson planning, and you know, now we're actually starting assessments, classroom management, and you're going to be looking at the education specifically in Namibia. So how is it defined culturally, and you know, what are their educational values? What you teach to a 6th grader in Namibia is going to be very different than what you teach to a 6th grader in China or the United States. So our orientation is very, very important for us. It's very intense, but it's important. As you guys mentioned, there's also the language training. That's another aspect of that, but the focus is definitely on teacher training. And now we're actually doing a teaching practicum. So at the end of orientation, you're actually going to be teaching in a classroom while you still have the support from your field director to kind of walk you through it and make you feel a little bit more comfortable, because as we know, those first few days are scary, and the majority of us haven't taught before. So yeah, so Jen, I know that you had taught before. Well, so this is actually interesting. I would love to hear, except we're running out of time. You know, I'm going to skip the orientation question. Jen, will you tell us about like the class size and the resources that you had?
So the class size varied a lot, generally large. Different classes were larger than others, but they were all large. I don't know, like 30s, 40s. Mm-hmm. And resources, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised. They weren't as, you know, scarce as I thought they would be. I definitely had to have a good relationship with my principal and ask and get the key to the supply closet and be persistent to get the supplies. But I had paint for my art classes. You know, we used a lot of recycled materials for art classes as well. So cardboard, old newspapers. So you have to be resourceful, but I was able to get paint, and there were paintbrushes already there and some basic supplies. For the classes, the notebooks and books we had for my English class and my BIS. No, BIS didn't have a textbook. I guess just for my English class. Like I had enough English textbooks. We had enough like workbooks for the kids to work in. Pens were something that I would ask my parents to send in care boxes, because they would only give you a box of pens to be able to lend to the children during classes, but they would always disappear or break, and they weren't very good quality pens in general. It's hard to find good pens in Namibia, so pens were kind of an ongoing issue. So getting those sent to you from the States, bringing a supply with you can be really great.
Yeah, very good advice. Okay, now I'm going to touch on, I'd say, the biggest question of the evening, and I want the feedback from both of you. So obviously we know that there are going to be some cultural challenges in the classroom. Looking at this list, corporal punishment, deference to authority, and cheating, which some of these things happen in many places, some of them less so. Kristen, I'll start with you. And please, if any of this did happen, especially corporal punishment, perhaps define that for some of our listeners, because they might not be familiar with the term. But did any of this come across in your classroom?
In my classroom, no. Well, I mean, corporal punishment did not. In my school, there was certainly corporal punishment. it was used pretty much by every teacher. Sometimes it meant, a slap across the hand with a ruler. Other times it was being whacked on the butt. We had one really terrible time where one of the teachers tied a kid to a tree, which we had a whole staff meeting about that. Most of it was kept in the classroom, so I think it went on more than I thought or more than I knew, and I just didn't see it. But I did realize the effects of it because as one of the only teachers that didn't, or as the only teacher, I think, that didn't use corporal punishment, the learners treated me differently because there was less or different consequences. And so that was something as a new teacher that I had to kind of learn how to do classroom management and learn how to, deal with consequences when they weren't really used to anything besides physical consequences. They weren't used to, extra homework or staying in the classroom later. At least in my classroom, it might be different in other schools. So there's definitely some deference to authority. A time or two I had to have a principal come in and talk to some of my older learners who weren't, no matter what I did, were not taking me seriously. That was more at the beginning of the year. And then I see on here cheating. That was definitely an issue. And I just don't think that they saw it as cheating because, at least from what I noticed, a lot of the way that other teachers taught in Namibia in my school were very traditional methods of kind of having lines up on the board or the lesson up on the board, and the kids spend the whole time copying the lesson down. And so then when I would give them homework, they would all copy off each other. And it took a very long time, and I wouldn't even say I completely succeeded, but eventually they kind of understood that if they had the same thing as someone else, that wasn't okay. But cheating, or at least copying, is definitely an issue.
Fantastic. That's a good kind of perspective into look into your classroom. Jen, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's great information. I didn't have much of a problem with cheating, actually. I don't know, maybe it was my school or at their level, because it was a primary school. Corporal punishment was definitely a challenge, and I talked to my principal about it sometimes, but it was definitely a cultural thing that I didn't change. It was hard, and it was definitely present in my school.
Yeah, and it's you guys have been back for probably over a year now, or 2 years, and you can say it a bit calmly, but I'm sure that it was a very emotional thing because I've just, from listening to people's stories, it's been really difficult. But of course, it's really important to say that, just like you said, you weren't there to change it. As a WorldTeach volunteer and as a perhaps North American or someone from whichever country that's not Namibia, you are definitely, an outsider to their culture, and you're not there to change their culture. You're there to teach them, whether it's English, math, or science, and to help them learn, your own culture and to learn from theirs. But we can definitely not participate in this nor approve it. But it's very difficult to walk into a school and expect to change a system like that. That is much deeper than WorldTeach. So it's important for us to bring that up with you guys now because that does happen. So thank you for that note. Okay, let's see. So I want to end on a happy note here because that's a bit heavy. Ladies, in a quick kind of summary, why do you think that you were supposed to do WorldTeach, and how have you seen it kind of change you since? I'll start with you, Kristen.
Oh, man. Well, I guess I came back and and like you said, we didn't go there to change the culture. We went to fill a position and teach and kind of give a new perspective on teaching and, expose the learners to maybe a different way of learning than they've had before. And I don't know, I'm in international development right now, and I do feel like a lot of programs are focused on changing things, and after living there, I mean, certainly in my eyes, there's some things that might function more efficiently if they were changed or whatever, but I guess one of the big things I took away is that just because it might work more efficiently doesn't mean that it needs to or whatever. But I mean, I don't know if you're asking for more right now, but it was one of the best years of my life. I would go back in a heartbeat. I would love to go back right now. And I learned a lot, and though I had never taught before, it was really neat to see how much I improved throughout the year as a teacher. I gained so much confidence, and even looking through my lesson plans and thinking back on my lessons at the beginning of the year, I was a completely different teacher than I was at the end of the year than I was at the beginning. I grew a lot as a teacher.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you. And Jen?
Well, I am certainly glad that I had the experience, and I think, you know, in very small ways I had influences on the children. I definitely tried to read to them and with them and put books in their hands as much as I could, because I was also in charge of the library, and the library was always a very hopping, busy place, and I got a bunch of new books for them from various donations, and so I think like that was probably a bigger mark on the school than anything else. I mean, our big problem was that the books just went everywhere, including in the bathrooms, and were ruined from like the sand and the water, and that was more because they were just loved having the books. Mm-hmm. And like for me, it was really great to have a year somewhere rural outside the city, like not, you know, without a lot of technology, without being busy, and having less of a social life was even good. Like it was kind of a reflective year for me, and I liked having a slower pace and just enjoying the company of the children and the environment and the nature around me, and having goats in my yard and running in the middle of nowhere for miles and miles, because once I ran, because I also ran daily, and I never had a problem, even though all my colleagues told me it was the most dangerous thing in the world to do. I had no problems. And, you know, after about 5 minutes running one direction, there would just be nature around me, no houses, no civilization, and that was a beautiful, calming thing. And the sunsets are beautiful in Namibia, so those are the things I'm left with. Those are the memories.
That's awesome. You have both drawn a great picture, like a very realistic.
And those are my children.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Perfect. Look, I did that just for you.
It's not my picture. I think the volunteer before me took that picture, but that was my garden fence. And you can see it has very special parts around it. Those boys built it, and they rebuilt it for me the following year.
Oh my God, that's awesome. Oh, that's great. That makes me so happy. Well, ladies, you guys have been so informative. Thank you for this reflection. I hope it doesn't make you miss Namibia too much. For the listeners, I'm just going to go back a couple of slides and very quickly show you this very important information on actually applying. Everything's online, so I'm not going to go too in depth, but the applications are being accepted until October 15th. The program is departing this December, right after Christmas. The materials are listed right there: resume, personal statement, college transcript, because this is only open to postgrads, 2 letters of recommendation, and an interview that's held with our admissions coordinator, whether it's over the phone or Skype. And you do have to be a native English speaker. So these are just the details. We know that they're not nearly as important as pictures like this one, when you actually have your students and your school and your fence and your garden and all of that. So if anyone, we've gone past the 8 p.m. hour, so my apologies for the delay, but thanks you guys for your patience. I'm going to be sending you all an email with a link to maybe 1 or 2 videos that we have from other volunteers, kind of a day in their life of actually teaching and actually living there, and the videos themselves are great. I would have shown it to you tonight, but I'd say listening to our panelists is a bit more valuable right now. So I'll send you that email. Definitely take a look, and if anybody has any questions, please let us know. We're excited. We're going to be sending about 10, maybe 12 people to Namibia this coming December, and you could be a part of it if it's, if it's there in your future. So let us know, and thank you both to the panelists, and everybody have a good evening. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome. Good night.
You're welcome.
Good night.